Welcome back to React 19 crash course. It's part 4. In today's part we are going to talk about useEffect lifecycle and fetching data. Previously we already built our destination cards using useState. And today we will understand what side effects are, we will master the useEffect hook, we will learn how React handles component lifecycles, we will fetch data from an API and use dependency arrays correctly, and we will talk also about cleanups. So in the beginning, what are side effects? In React, a side effect is anything that affects the outside world, like fetching data from an API, subscribing to a WebSocket, setting up a timer or interval, manipulating the DOM manually. These aren't things React can do during the normal render. We need a hook for that, and that's where useEffect comes in. For example, you choose travel destination for your trip, but you need also to pack your bag. So it doesn't affect your trip, but you kind of need to do it on the side. So in the beginning, let's talk about useEffect and the component lifecycle. useEffect is React's way of saying run this after rendering. If you learned React before and you used class components, this will sound familiar. So, for example, let's take the 3 main life cycles. It's component did mount. It runs once after the component mounts, renders. Component did update, runs after every re-render. And component will unmount, runs just before the component is removed from the DOM. And with useEffect you can do all of this in one place. So for example, if you pass an empty array, it mimics component did mount. If you pass value in dependency array, it mimics component did update, but only when value changes. And the return function acts like component will unmount. It's kind of like the hotel works. For example, you come into a hotel and do check-in, it's mount, you call every time or go to the front desk. When you want something, it's update, and you check out when you leave, it's unmount. You don't need to know more, to be honest. So when you use useEffect, in most cases you're going to use it when you fetch data from some API from backend. Fetching means retrieving external data, usually from REST API or database that your app doesn't have yet. And in React we use fetch or libraries like Axios to make HTTP requests. This is a side effect what I talked about already. We do it with useEffect so it doesn't interrupt rendering. It's kind of ordering food from the restaurant, for example, instead of cooking. It happens outside your house, but you still have the same result. So let's write useEffect example. First of all, we need to import it. And then usually you write it somewhere in the very beginning. Receive a callback function, and then you also need to provide a dependency. So here happens the whole magic. Let's do console log and write use effect 1 and see when and what happens. Actually, let's see in the beginning what happens if we don't provide any dependency. So let's run our project. Let's go to developer tools and to console, and you see that if we didn't, let's do reload, and you see if we don't provide any dependencies, then it runs 2 times. Now let's try to provide a dependency, for now without anything, and let's see what happens now. Let's reload it, and you see it again 2 times, and you must be wondering what is happening here. So actually there is a thing that not everyone knows about it, that useEffect runs twice in development, because when strict mode is enabled by default, and it intentionally runs certain functions twice, including the setup and cleanup of effects to help you find bugs in components and that aren't handling, for example, remounting or side effects properly. So in production, it's going to run as expected only once if you provide a dependency, but if you not, it's going to run after every re-render. And in order to prove you this point, I am going to do the next thing. I'm going already right now to add a cleanup. No, I don't want to set any destinations. I want just to do console log, and let's say useEffect clean. Let's try now and see what happens. Now let's again reload, and you see now we see also the cleanup function. So yeah, it's kind of really confusing because you don't expect it, but yeah, that's unfortunately how it works, or maybe fortunately. So again, if you don't provide any dependency array, then it's going to run after every render, and it's useful when you always want the effect to run, but I don't think that you want to. For example, it could be used only for some animation frame updates, but really I don't think that you're going to need it, and probably there are much more ways to do it. Empty dependency array, it runs after the first render, and it's equivalent to component did mount, and its cleanups also run after the component unmounts. And when we, for example, provide some dependencies, then it's going to run after the first render, because let's say that the value also changed. It was initialized, and then it runs again whenever any value in the array changes. And it also runs cleanup before the effect reruns, and also when the component unmounts. Let's check, for example, if we have here anything. Let's try to add here destinations, and see what now is going to happen. Let's do reload again. So in the beginning, yeah, we see again that it ran after render, and also let's, for example, add something already. Hello, let's plan trip, and you see that actually there was again cleanup and then the effect itself. So the destinations array changed, and as I mentioned already before it, there was a cleanup, and after that the useEffect itself ran again. So yeah, in order to avoid more bugs and everything, you need to understand it. It's a little bit confusing in the beginning, but once you understand it, it's going to be fine. So yeah, now we want to fetch the real data from real API. We want to use for this REST countries API. In most cases, when you use some API or some REST APIs. There are, like, I'm sure you already know that there are 4 types of actions that can be done, and there are docs that you can use. Let's see, for example, that we want to fetch all countries in the very beginning, then we can do, for example, this call. So how we are going to do it? For now, we are going just to create a function, create a call, and see that everything works. So, for example, let's create a function, fetch all countries. It's going to be a async function. For now, let's just receive the result. So, for example, we are going to receive the result, and we are going to do fetch, and fetch receives a link. We are going to put it here, and except for it, it is going to, the data usually should come in JSON format. That's why we want to receive data from a result. And for now, we are going just to console log data. Yeah. And that's what we are going to do on mount. That's why we don't need any dependencies. We don't need any cleanup function, whatever. So we are just going to do fetch all countries. Don't worry about this warning. It's usually always happens because useEffect doesn't accept async functions. Like, you can do async await in useEffect, inside useEffect. So of course, if you want, if it really bothers you, then you can, for example, do then and catch. But it really depends on what code writing approach you prefer. I personally prefer async await because it's shorter, and you can add also try catch blocks. So yeah, let's just do it. And also, I didn't tell you that, for example, sometimes when you write code here inside useEffect, and you also receive some kind of warnings or errors from ESLint that you didn't add anything or some variables into dependency array, but you always have to sync properly if you really need to do it. And I know that many people say that no, your code is horrible if you are using ESLint ignore and such things. And if, for example, it says to you to add something to dependency, you have to do it. No. I really saw many bugs when people just add everything into dependencies, and then this useEffect and this fetching or any other logic, it happens on every, like, you remember, yes, that it happens few times. It happens before cleanup. It happens when every value changes. So just think about it. You added 10 dependencies and it happens 10 times. It's just crazy. So when you don't need anything in your dependencies, then just don't add it. You still should think properly about it and not do it like a robotic not to do it like in a robotic way. So yeah, let's see what we have, if we have anything. So yeah, I reload, and here you can see data. And yeah, for example, we received here state of Eritrea, and we received other different informations. So yeah, that's what we actually going to use. And one more thing, I already talked a lot about useEffect, but I didn't explain you what actually hook itself is. Hooks are special functions introduced in React starting from React 16 that let you hook into React features like state and lifecycle methods inside functional components. And before hooks, like I already mentioned, state and lifecycle logic were only available in class components. And hooks allow you to use these features in simpler, more concise functional components. So how they work, for example, we already also learned about useState and useEffect. So, and usually all these hooks, they have already some of the logic in themselves, and then they just return or functions or some values, or like in useEffect they do something with logic that you want to do something with it inside them. We are going later write our own hooks and learn more about it. In the very beginning I was really afraid of writing my custom hooks, but now as you understand it, it's like nothing scary. And that's also how you can write better code and reuse it and share logic inside different components. And they actually help you avoid issues with this keyword in classes. So in React class components, again, if you saw it, we often needed to use this keyword to access props, state, or methods. And it can be confusing because you have to bind methods in the constructor to keep the right this context. If you forget to bind, your event handlers or methods won't have the right this and can cause bugs or errors. And sometimes this changes unexpectedly depending on how a function is called, which leads to tricky bugs. For example, here you can see a class counter, and it has constructor where you also say initialize the state. For this we use state, and for example this handle click, you need to bind it to this. And yeah, and as you see, so every time you need to use this, and also the same as this state, you also need to use these props and this handle click, etc. So it's really confusing, and it's really not necessary. So it's absolutely great that React changed it, and now we work in most cases only with functional components. Because functional components, they don't have this, they are just plain JavaScript functions, and hooks like useState and useEffect, they give you direct access to state and lifecycle features without needing to use this. And event handlers and functions inside functional components just work as normal functions with access to variables via closure, no binding required. So again, this makes code easier to write, read, and maintain. So for clearer understanding how actually how the whole process of fetching data works, and after that we are going to move it to global store, but in most cases we also need some sort of loading state, because you don't want users to not to understand, let's say, what is going on. For example, if they click button, or when they just enter the page, you need to see some kind of loader or anything. And for example, in the beginning you're going to say if loading, then for example you're going to return just some sort of indication that page is loading. Something like this. And only when it is loaded, you are going to see all these elements and destination cards, etc. So for example, also here in the very beginning, we are going to provide try catch. And to do it in try catch block, and before we make a request, we set loading true. And only, for example, here you catch some sort of error, and then you're going to do something with this error. For now, let's just console log it. And also, if you catch an error, you need to set your loading state to false, because you probably are going to want to show the user what happened. And there might be actually few approaches. You can write some sort of finally and do set loading false there, but for now let's do it just here. So for example, when you received already all the data, then you can do set loading false. So let's see what happens. Let's reload the page again. And because everything works really fast, you don't manage to see pages loading. But for example, you can see that it blinked, and when it blinked, it actually did work in that way. We can I can show you it just by, for example, commenting out set loading false. And then for now, I always going to show the loading state, and that's how you can see that, page is loading. But after we receive data, there is already no need in it. Reload. So that's usually how you manage all the situations connected to fetching. Quick recap what we learned in this part. We talked about side effects. We talked about when and why runs useEffect. We talked about dependency arrays, about cleanup and that it prevents memory leaks, how to use async functions, how to fetch data, and that useEffect replaces the old lifecycle methods. In the next part, we will combine what we learned to display dynamic data with styling, loading states, and more interactivity. You'll get your travel planner looking sleek and smart, and maybe we'll even add search or filter options. See you there.